As Whitney said, I'm Kevin Hart. I'm with the Division of Coastal Management. I'm a field rep. Been doing it for about a year and a half now, covering Terrell and Washington counties, Hertford and Bertie counties as well. Prior to that, I actually worked for the Division of Coastal Management and Marine Fisheries reviewing these major CAMA permits. So I have experience with those as well. And so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And there may be a little bit of rehashing with Steve when he was answering some questions, but just stick with me. So, we've been talking about living shorelines and what they are. And of course, I got another definition which is different than Carolyn's and Steve's and Whitney's, but similar to constructed out of sloping riprap stone, including granite, marl, oyster shell, or broken concrete placed offshore and parallel to shore to reduce wave energy, to protect existing or newly planted wetland and marsh grasses. And something that's left out of this definition is also the sheet pile sills, which has been talked about before as well. And just let me take a step back as well. The permitting that we're going to be talking about today is for the 20 coastal counties, so what's handled by the Division of Coastal Management. I know there's some people in here from Raleigh, areas west. You might just need to talk to your Corps of Engineer representative to determine what kind of permitting is needed from them. So to go with the definition, here's a picture. This is the NCAT site out on Ocracoke. It gives you can see out offshore you have your rock and your sloping fill, and then your plants. So when we talk about permitting from coastal management, we have two different types of permits, the general permits and major permits. The general permit is kind of like an easy button, so it fits a certain amount of factors or certain conditions that we can do right on site. These general permit conditions have been reviewed by the other state and federal resource and regulatory agencies, and they're okay with these conditions, so it allows us to issue the permits for these projects. Once an applicant contacts the Division of Coastal Management field rep and they have the proper paperwork from the adjacent property owners, we can issue a permit usually within 5 days. Once we issue that permit, it's good for 120 days. And then the major CAMA permits, these are the permits that don't fit in the box of the general permits. So they're reviewed by 10 state and 4 federal agencies. So the state agencies include the Division of Water Resources, Marine Fisheries, Wildlife Commission, Cultural Resources, and State Properties, to name a few. And then the 4 federal agencies include the Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries, and I'm drawing a blank on the other one right now. I believe so. The Corps will circulate out to those agencies if they feel it's necessary for the review. Generally speaking, these permits take 75 days to be issued. That's the average, and it's done out of the Morehead City office. And just to give you an idea of what you get for when you get one of these permits, this is an example of a general permit. There's very little paperwork that's involved from the applicant when we're doing these. The only thing that they're going to have to provide is adjacent property notification saying that they've been notified, or the adjacent property owner has been notified about the project that's going to go on. And then if a property owner isn't going to be able to get the permit, they can have an authorized agent, which is a consultant, an engineer, or a contractor. They can sign a form giving them approval to be able to get the permits in their behalf. So like I said, this is just an example of it. Property owner information, the project location, and then the field rep will come in and draw in this area what the project's going to be. And like I said, you give a check to the field rep signs the permit, property owner signs the permit, your permit's good to go, and you're ready to start building. And then this is an example of a major CAMA permit. Same thing, the information on top, that's the information about the project and the plats that are associated with it, and then specific conditions. And these permits are good for 3 years, and you can renew them if you need to. So, like I said before, we have a general permit for living shorelines. Right now, it had 29 specific conditions regarding a living shoreline. This has included coordinating with the Army Corps of Engineers, or getting a permit from the Corps, coordinating with the Division of Marine Fisheries. A lot of other conditions that, just as Steve said, it's just a very long permit for a general permit. So we're actually in the process of right now of modifying that permit to get rid of some of the duplicity. And we're doing that, I guess it was about 2 weeks ago. Division of Coastal Management staff presented it to the Coastal Resource Commission with these modifications, and they've approved it to go out for public comment to modify the rule to shorten the length of this general permit. And some of the changes, like I said, there's going to be less coordination with marine fisheries, water resources, but it's also going to change, the general permit's not going to include fill, and it's going to also change the height restrictions on that general permit. But like I said, even if we get a general permit from Coastal Management, you're going to have to go to the Corps of Engineers and go through the individual permit process. So with a general permit, it's $200, but then you're still going to have to go through the Corps and get their individual permit, and I'm not sure how much that costs. But at this time, we're still coordinating with the Army Corps of Engineers on how to get them on board with our permit. So like I said, we're still in discussions. The Corps doesn't have a legal framework right now at this point in time to be able to work with us with that general permit. So since they don't have that legal framework with that general permit, in North Carolina, we kind of have a unique situation. It's called the 291 Programmatic General Permit for CAMA Major Permits. And what that means is that it's going to be one application. So an applicant comes to the Division of Coastal Management, works on an application, submits it to the Coastal Management, and then we circulate it out to all the agencies, including the Corps, and the Corps circulates it around. And so that's the application, and you wouldn't have to do 2 applications. And so with keeping that in mind, that's why it's actually easier and faster at this point in time to go through the major CAMA permit process and get that permit. We say that it seems like a lot of work, and you say the words major CAMA, and people get afraid. They just don't want to do it because it sounds like a lot more paperwork. But in actuality, it's really not that much more paperwork or much more that's entailed. And we've seen everybody from property owners apply for these permits to engineers and consulting firms. So anybody can really get one of these applications together. And the field rep is most of the field reps are very willing to work with an applicant to be able to get their application in, because this is a big initiative by our agency and all the other agencies to get these people more familiar with them. So like I said before, it's reviewed by 10 state and 4 federal agencies. They're averaging about 75 days, but like I said, these are we're trying to get these out and permitted faster than some of the average other permits. And so we can issue these within 30 to 45 days is what's been averaging. And then with these applications, there's certain requirements that need to be included in the package for a complete application. And so once that application is complete and submitted, that 75 days starts from then. But for the application to be complete, we need to include adjacent property owner notification. So that, like I said, we need to tell the adjacent property owner needs to sign something to say that they're okay with you doing that project. The applicant needs to include a copy of the deed, a top view drawing, cross-section drawings, the application form, which includes our MP1 form and the MP2 form. The MP1 form, it's like 2 pages, and it's background information about the property and the property owner. And then the MP2 form, which is the excavation and fill form, and that talks about the footprint, about how much, you'd asked about fill, how much fill is going to be included, the footprint, square footage of that, the square footage of the rock, the offshore rock, stuff like that. And then the major CAMA permit is going to cost $400, and you're not going to have to pay anything else for that once that's paid. And then also left off of this is a narrative that you also need to include, and that narrative is going to include the who, what, when, where, why the project's going to be done. And then so in that narrative also include if there was any avoidance and minimization that needed to be done, include that in there. And so like I said, you need to have a top plan drawing and a cross section. And here's an example of it. And just something to keep in mind, it doesn't need to be a professionally drawn drawing. It could be done by anybody. You can see the top plan, that's a hand drawn. It just needs to include certain things like a title block, talking about the scale, when it was drawn, who drew it, the property owner information, the adjacent property owner over here and over here. And then also if there's submerged aquatic vegetation present or oysters present, you should include those on the drawings because that's something that the review agencies will be looking for. And also label the water body and then have your north arrow on there to know direction-wise. And then a cross section over here. Same thing, your title block, your height and elevations, your typical cross section. So I kind of touched on it before, but here's the process for a major camo application. So when somebody comes to you about doing a live-in shoreline, you should contact the field rep, the local field rep for that area, and meet them out on site and talk about site-specific conditions, and if there's anything else specific for that area that needs to be thought about, such as submerged aquatic vegetation, oysters, the wetlands that are present, navigation issues. But once you talk about that, and you get your application complete, you're going to submit it to the local field rep. They're going to circulate it out to those their state and federal agencies. And then those agencies are going to submit their comments to our Morehead City office, and they'll assemble all the comments and make a decision on whether or not a permit will be issued or denied. And so if it's issued, it's going to include certain conditions. It may or may not include certain conditions. The applicant signs it, the permit, and then they send it back, and it's an active permit. And then you can go ahead and start working. If the permit's denied, there is an appeal process that you can go through to try to get it approved. So just a couple tips for expediting the applications. This way, when you send in your application, hopefully it's a complete application and the time clock can start there. You need to take into account if the structure, if you're going to include a structure offshore, if it's going to have navigational impacts. If it's going to cause navigational impacts, you need to include some type of markers on the structure so that people know if they're out boating, they'll be able to see these structures if they're submerged. If there's submerged aquatic vegetation present, those impacts need to be accounted for. Generally, the resource agencies look for you to avoid those impacts, trying to find a place for that structure to go without having the footprint present on it. The same thing for oysters. If there's oysters or clams present, just try to avoid those areas. You may want to include the predominant wind direction, so it gives you a little bit more justification for the size of your structure and how far above water it's going to have to get, above normal water level or mean high water. Gives you that reason. Include information about the bottom type, whether it's mud or soft bottom, sandy. Kind of gives you an idea of how big the footprint needs to be or what kind of habitat trade-offs you're going to have. And then also make sure you're including gaps for marine animal movement. So Steve mentioned on his best management practice talk. If these gaps aren't included, chances are your application will end up there'll be comments from the resource agencies, and you'll have to work with them to try to make a project that works and it's approved. And also just something to keep in mind is that once you talk to the field rep that's for that area, they'll give you certain ideas about certain specific conditions about that project, but you might want to work with them to go through what we have is called a scoping meeting process. And what that is you get everybody in the room that's responsible for the reviewing that project. So you can get the state and federal agencies that'll review the project along with the applicant, and basically we'll sit down and talk about that project and talk about ways that the issues with the project, if there are any, and then how to avoid and minimize those impacts. And so I'm not Kelly Spivey, but if you have any questions about it, I'm more than willing to take them now.
If you really want to get this program off the ground using the living shoreline, I think you need to look at getting that general permit taken care of, because most waterfront property owners, when we get a call to go out and look at a project, if you say major permit, I mean, that's an immediate, do I really want to go through this? Because it's got a reputation for being an extremely onerous process. And when the agencies that have to review everything respond, they usually come back with comments, and there's a lot of back and forth. And when they're going through an engineering firm, the time is money, so all the response to the comments runs the cost up, and it costs them a lot more than $400 to get the permit, as well as usually taking a month and a half, 2 months, 3 months.
Just a couple things to keep in mind. We are working with the Corps of Engineers right now to determine if there is some way we can work on it, making that general permit usable for both Division of Coastal Management and the Corps of Engineers to get a permit issued. And that's still in the process right now. The Corps is also working on a nationwide permit. I'm not really sure how that's going to affect North Carolina permitting because from what I've heard, that review is still going to include that the Corps of Engineers is going to have to circulate it to Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries for impacts to endangered species, essential fish habitat, things like that. But it's still in the works. We're still trying to figure out where it's going to go. But then with the intensity or the amount of work that's going to be included with the major CAMA, I have heard people say that if it's not a general permit, your permit's denied, which isn't, it's not true. And a way to cut down those costs so you wouldn't necessarily have to go out and have this back and forth is to come in for one of those scoping meetings. I know at the Washington office, we do them pretty often. We have somebody in our office, Lynn Hardison, and she'll cover the Washington regional office as well as the Elizabeth City office, and she'll organize these meetings and get everybody in one spot, and we'll sit down. And once you go through that process, you're going to have very little back and forth once the application's in, if you take into account the comments that are made during that meeting. So that's just...
Yeah, well, I've been through that process, and it does work, but when you explain it to somebody, you can tell them about the living shoreline, and they're like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Then when you explain the permitting process to them, they say, here's my $200, let's just put in a bulkhead. And
yeah,
so,
I understand, and we're trying to find ways to get around that, and this is one of the reasons why we're doing this, is try to promote them to people, and this way they can see them.
Other questions for Gavin?
Kevin, thank you. Some comments before we're done, like, and I understand them, the elevation separations are critical, that some of the work needs to be done by surveyors and designers and engineers. But when it comes to the permit, any sketch would do. And that just doesn't cut it sometimes, because then people want to do it themselves. It's critical work, needs to be done well. And then a lot of times, just like any sketch would do, it just doesn't cut it to explain our clients that they need to do it properly and spend the time and money to do it right. In addition, like Al said earlier, sometimes it's not that the major CAMA permit be difficult or not, it's just the time. And for most clients or people want to do something, 3 months is just, it's not what they want to hear. It may not be the cost at the end of the day, it's just that time delay, just as a comment.
Yeah, and that's why we're trying to work on getting something with the Corps to speed up that process. And if we were to do a general permit with a living shoreline, it'll still be that, it'll probably still end up taking that, month and a half, something along those lines. But we're working on it.
You touched on avoidance and minimization. If you go through that process and you still have SAV impacts, will you require mitigation for that?
Potentially, and that's something that really the Division of Marine Fisheries, Wildlife, Water Resources, or National Marine Fisheries would prescribe if they feel that you've done everything that you can to avoid those impacts and minimize those impacts. And then if you need to, it can be requested. At least at this point in time, there's always times for change.
Anyone have questions?
Kevin, what is the most common reason for a denial of a major permit? And another question for you is, what percentage of the permits that go through the process actually are permitted in the end?
Living shoreline wise?
Right. Or more broadly, with some of the more typical designs?
Well, most of the time, I've been in my position for about 1.5 years for these for the field rep side of things, but I did review them for, I reviewed them for about 5 years, 6 years, and I covered from the Neuse River and north, and I don't think we ever denied one of these living shorelines, but we have worked with applicants to modify the design to prevent denials from them. I mean, Steve, have you seen any that were denied for?
No, I have not, you know, I really haven't, and that's, you know, one of the benefits I have not been involved in or known of a living shoreline project where the permit was denied, and you know, that's a benefit of having that scoping process and eliminating that back and forth, in the application back and forth, and if we've hired a consultant, reducing that cost. So the more you can plan and learn about the habitats that are offshore the shoreline you want to work on and avoid those sensitive as best as possible, you know, you'll eliminate or reduce permit denials and costs associated with design changes. And it's overall, I think in the division-wide for all major CAMA permits, it's probably in the mid to high 90s that are issued and probably less than 5% that are actually end up in denial. You know, and we hear about them when we get a bad project in or a project that's got a lot of issues around it and it's headed towards denial. You hear about it, whether it's from Wilmington or Southport or if it's in Currituck County. I mean, we all hear about it. So very, very few major CAMA permits are denied, but I think that's a result of the work by the field staff and the pre-application scoping process that we avoid those situations.
Any more questions? All right, well, Kevin will be around also if anything comes up, and thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you. And if you have,